Let me begin by explaining the sequence of the course from here on in. So the idea is that for the next 2 weeks, we're going to deal with the programmatic alternatives in 2 particular contemporary settings. First, the United States, and then Europe, the European Union. Then begins a part of the course in which we discuss the major themes of this argument about alternative. First, the economy, the democratization of the economy, and its institutional content, in particular in relation to the now most advanced practice of production, the knowledge economy. Then, the alternatives in the political realm and the organization of democracy. Then, civil society and education, and finally, globalization. And in the end, in the final part of the course, some of the normative and social theoretical presuppositions of this programmatic argument. Remember, my intention in the entire argument is to develop, discuss, and defend a particular idea, a particular conception of the alternative, on the supposition that the major enemy is nihilism. The major enemy is not this or that alternative to the argument that I will present, but the fundamental premise that there is no alternative. The theme with which we began last week, the dictatorship of no alternatives. And I will want you to assist me and engage my argument in every direction, but not in a vacuum, in the light of the particular alternative that I will be struggling to develop in the argument of the course. Now, what I would like to do today is to help develop some of the central conceptions, the institutional conceptions and the normative or philosophical conceptions to which I will be referring as we go along. And in particular, 2 institutional conceptions: the conception of a high-energy democracy and the conception of the democratized market economy, in particular in relation to the now most advanced practice of production, a knowledge economy for the many, as a substitute for the knowledge economy for the few that we have. And I want to preface that general abstract institutional discussion by going back to the point at which I left the argument last week. The reinterpretation of the contrast between the right and the left, the conservatives and the progressives, for which I argued. And because this is such a fundamental part of the argument, I think we should give more time to discuss it and have a conversation among ourselves. Remember, the conventional form of the ideological debate today in the world is and has been for a long time what you could call shallow freedom against shallow equality. On this interpretation of the basic ideological debate before us, the conservatives are those who prioritize freedom, and the progressives are those who prioritize equality. Against the background of the established institutional arrangements, The progressives say that the established form of the market order should be humanized. It should be rendered less unequal. And the conservatives want to deepen freedom against the same institutional background of the existing form of the market order. Shallow equality against shallow freedom. Now, notice one of the paradoxical consequences of this ideological and rhetorical situation. Take a theory of justice, of distributive justice, like the Rawlsian theory of justice. Its central propositions seem to have to do with equality, with the attenuation of inequality. But its pragmatic residue, its consequence, and its function in context is to serve as a philosophical justification for the attenuation of inequalities in the present arrangements of the market. It is a delayed philosophical expression or reaction to the last major institutional and ideological settlement in the advanced societies, which was the social democratic or the social liberal settlement, which in the United States took the form of Roosevelt's New Deal. So in context, the egalitarian profession of faith is cut down to size, meaning that it becomes a prop, a support for compensatory redistribution by progressive taxation and by compensatory social entitlements. And although the theory seems to be radically egalitarian in its intentions, the practical consequence is the justification of this ameliorative compensatory operation within the context of the present form of the market order. Someone who was interested in the reconstruction of the economic order would, of course, not have begun that way, because what that operation results in is the humanization of the present economic arrangements rather than their substitution. So we have equality or freedom implied within the framework or within the limits of the present economic arrangements. That's what, in this whole historical period, it has meant to be a conservative or a progressive, a rightist or a leftist. And then the argument at the end of the last class then turned into a discussion of an alternative interpretation of the contrast between the right and the left. And I then suggested two criteria by which, on this reinterpretation, to distinguish the right from the left. The first criterion has to do with the relation of the project to the institutional order of society. And the second criterion has to do with the aspiration, the goal, the purpose. The first division would say the conservatives are those who allow their projects, their political economic project, to remain within the confines of the established institutional framework. And the progressives would be those who insist on transgressing the boundaries of this framework. Not transgressing it on the old model of classical European social theory, that there's a system and that the system is replaced when it is replaced all at once in one fell swoop. But on another idea of structural change, the idea that structural change, as it really happens in history, is always fragmentary. And the idea of total change, the substitution of one indivisible system for another, is at best an idealized limit. So that would be the first criterion by which to distinguish the right from the left. Structural change, understood not as systemic change in the sense of Marxism, but as piecemeal change of the institutional presuppositions and the ideological assumptions with which they are associated. That would be then one way of distinguishing the right from the left with respect to the practice. And with respect to the purpose, to the spirit, to the aim, the distinction would be what? Is the aim of the left deep equality, meaning an equality of circumstance or of outcome, or is it something else? The example given by the classical liberals and socialists of the 19th century is that the aim was not radical equality in that sense, equality of outcome or of circumstance. The aim was to bring the mass of ordinary humanity up to a higher level, to allow it to live a larger life with broader scope, with more intensity, with larger capacities. And the struggle against inequality was entirely subsidiary to that larger objective. Inequality was objectionable only to the extent that it prevented the mass of common humanity from becoming greater together. So on this second criterion, the division between right and left, between progressives and conservatives, is a contrast between those for whom it is natural for human life to be small, the conservatives, and for whom there is only an elite of extraordinary agents who are exempt from this constraint of belittlement. The mass of humanity is exempt for it only in exceptional moments, like war, in which sacrificial devotion is required for larger objectives. But otherwise, only an elite of disruptors, of innovators, of geniuses, of adventurers is free from this decree of belittlement. And the progressives would be those who say, we can all become greater, bigger, provided that we become bigger together. Now that would be a very fundamental reinterpretation of the distinction between right and left. And on the terms of that way of distinguishing the right and the left, the vast majority of social democrats would have to be classified as conservative. So it is no small change in the interpretation of the ideological categories. Now let me stop there and ask for your observations, your objections, your ideas about this reinterpretation of right and left. So, in this debate about the meaning of right and left, there are, in principle, three types of positions. One position is to say the distinction between right and left is not a distinction that we are free to reshape. It's given by history. It's a fact. The second position would say the distinction between right and left has lost its meaning. It's an ideological vocabulary that we have inherited that has now lost its sense. And the third position would say it can have a sense, but it's a sense that we must produce. It's not a sense that is immediately available to us. So the institutionally conservative social democrat is then the humanizer of the economic order on its present form. He proposes to humanize it mainly through progressive taxation on one side and compensatory social entitlements or redistribution on the other side, but he doesn't propose to change it. These are the options before us. What do you think? Yes.
Could you please say more about the small life that conservatives...
The small lives?
The small life that they want and what that means. I'm thinking in terms of economics because I think a lot of conservatives do kind of want to be special and to achieve a lot of richness, and they have that goal. So can that be part of the small life, or would that be separate?
Can what be part of a small life?
Wanting to be the rich.
Wanting to be rich.
Yeah.
Well, Jean-Jacques Rousseau had an opinion about that. He says in the Emile, they couldn't become men, so they decided to become rich. So the idea there's a kind of substitute bigness, right? But that's all a subject of controversy, of course. I think the essence of this idea of bigness is a form of agency. It's the ability to turn the tables on the context, on the world that you're in. And that then leads forward to another part of the normative discussion last week, which is then the interpretation of freedom. Freedom is freedom in the exercise of agency, the ability to act and to create. And remember then, because it's fundamental to everything that we're going to discuss, the argument about what freedom is. So I'm making this proposal that the aim is not rigid equality. The aim is deep freedom. Deep freedom meaning an enhancement of agency. And then you asked this question about money. So money is, as it were, the cheap form of agency. So remember Robinson Crusoe on his island. He accumulates things, because he has nothing else to do with his time. And the accumulation of things is a substitute for dependence on people. One of the principles of the English novel. You accumulate things so as not to depend on people. And one of the uses of money in these societies is that money is a substitute for dependence and for solidarity. But of course, this reinterpretation of the contrast between the right and the left then focuses us on a debate about freedom. What is deep freedom? In what does it consist? And you remember that last week I made a particular proposal. It consists in the management of a series of contradictions. So first there's the contradiction between the self and others. We can be free only to the extent that we're connected. Money is in fact not a substitute for dependence or interdependence. But every connection seems to threaten us with servitude. How can we be connected without being subjugated? This is the first question that arises in the debate about freedom. And we could say we have an experience of that, a limited personal experience of that in love. Love is a form of mutual recognition and acceptance in which we have the experience that the connection to someone else adds something to the sentiment of being, to our experience of self-assertion, rather than taking something away. But love seems not to be feasible outside the context of intimacy. Christ commanded us to love the stranger, which seems to be something that we cannot do, something that is impossible. And therefore, the moral philosophers offer us, instead of love, the cold comfort of an impersonal benevolence. So if we don't accept this cold comfort of their impersonal benevolence, the altruistic, rationalistic benevolence that they offer us as a replacement for love, how do we find an equivalent to love in life among strangers? And the answer is cooperation. But all the concrete forms of cooperation are contested. And the struggle over their forms fills the pages of history. That's all of history. The struggle over the alternative forms of cooperation. So the first core sense of freedom is that freedom is connection without subjugation. But its particular institutional forms are always the subject of a contest. So, for example, take the market. What is the market? Defined from the standpoint of these moral categories. The market is a simplified form of cooperation among strangers that is impossible when there is no trust and unnecessary when there is high trust. So the market order is a form of cooperation that flourishes in the context of a modicum of trust generalized among strangers. But then we discover that different market orders differ among themselves in their demands on trust. So, conventional industry and the market order that goes with it is a low trust organization. Command and control. Command and control in the context of trust, of low trust, a modicum of low trust. So the traditional societies radically distinguish insiders and outsiders, no trust for the outsider and high trust for the insider. And then the social theorists like Max Weber observed, the moral precondition for the diffusion of the modern market orders was the generalization of trust among strangers. But the initial forms of it, the classical market order of the 18th or 19th century, presupposed low trust and the generalization of low trust among strangers. And the contractual expression of this low trust economic culture was the predominance of the traditional unified absolute property right, all of the component powers of property brought together and vested in the same right holder, the owner. Absolute property, absolute in scope and in time. And then comes a different market order, a different form of economic organization, the one that is emerging now in the vanguard of the economy, that we call the knowledge economy. And it seems to depend on a higher level of trust. The workers have to be trusted to a higher extent. So command and control are effaced and replaced by a higher level of trust and of discretion are required and demanded of all participants in the process of production. So, for example, the Toyota method of manufacture, the workers have to be involved. And in the relation among work teams, within firms and even among firms in the advanced parts of the production system, cooperative competition. They must compete and cooperate at the same time, part of the same elevation of trust. So a higher form of production of economic arrangements of economic life arises, which demands an accumulation of social capital. And the contractual expression of it is the predominance of the incomplete bargain, the ongoing contractual relation, as opposed to the classical contract, the arm's length, fully articulated bargain, which is exhausted in a single performance. So I'm simply saying that there's an intimate relation between the diversity of economic arrangements that arise in history, in fact, in recent history, and these different ways of solving the problem of how we can be connected without being subjugated. So let's say that's one domain of freedom. We are free to the extent that we can connect without submitting. The second domain of freedom has to do with the social world. To be free, we must engage in a particular world. No one can be free alone in the forest. We can be free only in a social context, in a thick social world. But every social world seems to exact from us as the price that in order to engage in it, we submit. We submit, for example, to the role that we have within that world and accept its rules. So how then can we be free, or how are we free? We are free to the extent that we can engage without submitting. That's a second definition of freedom. We are free to change the vocabulary. We are free to the extent that we can be insiders and outsiders at the same time. Meaning, we can engage in that world, but we can deny the last word to it and keep the last word for ourselves. We can retain the power to resist it even as we participate in it. That's freedom. That's the second meaning of freedom. And the third meaning of freedom is not about the relation of the self to another self or other selves, or the relation of the self to a social world. The third meaning of freedom is the relation of the self to itself. To be free, we have to create a habitual mode of being, a character, but at the same time we have to be able to disrupt the character. We can't allow the character to become crystallized or rigidified and suck the life out of us. So we're free if we can form a habitual way of being and subvert it at the same time. So this is the third context of freedom. Now we come back to your question about, with respect to what is this freedom, this agency. It's with respect to freedom in all these three senses, is one way of thinking of it. And of course, our opportunity, our ability to combine these contradictory experiences in the same experience depends both on the organization of society and of culture and on the conduct of life, on the way we live. So from this, then, there emerges a proposal. The proposal is that we are bigger, greater, or freer with respect to this good of agency according to the management of these contradictions. And that this is the subject of the historical conflicts, as it is the subject of our vacillations in the conduct of life. So that's the ultimate subject of the ideological dispute, according to this way of thinking. Whether freedom in this larger and contradictory sense can be enhanced for the mass of ordinary men and women or not. And on that proposal, that's one of the criteria by which we would distinguish the right from the left. But the other proposal has to do with the structure of society. The leftists then would deny that the structure is there on a take it or leave it basis. And they would insist on relating their projects to some transformation of the order. Now that's, of course, very different from Marxism. Because in classical European social theory in general, and in Marx in particular, the assumption is the structure, Marx called them the modes of production, one of which is capitalism, are there on a take it or leave it basis. And structural change, when it happens all at once. Thus the binary idea of politics to which I referred last week. There are two types of politics. There's reform and revolution. Reform is the management of an indivisible system, and revolution is the substitution of one system for another. And I'm saying by opposition to this idea, that the change of the whole order is to a large extent a fantasy. Because the only way in which structural change ordinarily happens in history is it happens part by part, piece by piece, step by step. But it can continue. And if it continues, it can become revolutionary under a certain conception. So there's a fundamental mistake in the assumption that change that is profound is total, and change that is superficial is fragmentary. The character of change is revealed only over time. And in the sequence, in the succession, it's not revealed instantaneously. Now let's take a concrete phenomenon about which we'll speak a great deal here in the course, which is the insular knowledge economy. In every historical period, there is a most advanced practice of production. Now the most advanced practice of production is this insular knowledge economy. It's not just advanced manufacture. It's also intellectually dense services and even precision or scientific agriculture. So in other words, it's multi-sectoral. But in each sector, it now appears as a fringe, excluding the vast majority of workers in the firms. So if you take a whole national economy and imagine this development extended, its consequence is to say the vanguard will be occupied by an insular minority in each sector, and the vast majority of people will be condemned to some kind of make work. Around the vanguard, there'll be a periphery of technical assistants, lawyers, accountants, management consultants, and so forth. Who will be enriched by the services that they render to this vanguard. But the vast majority of people will be nothing, and that will then be the practical meaning of this littleness, of this belittlement. So on the interpretation of the leftist or the progressive, which I just suggested, that will be what he cannot accept. The insular knowledge economy will be the enemy. But of course, the knowledge economy for the few could become the starting point for the creation of a knowledge economy for the many. And then its meaning would completely change. Now, with those remarks, I hope to have introduced some of the categories that are relevant to the argument in the course. But now I want to go on to other conceptions that have to do with the institutions. And in particular, politics and the economy, the production system. So the major innovations of the 20th century, the greatest institutional and ideological refoundation had to do with the humanization of the market order through compensatory redistribution. In the years before and after the Second World War, in all of the advanced societies. And the question is, what comes next? And one proposal is that what comes next is a struggle over the future of the knowledge economy. Now let me address then two ideas that are central in our arguments here, and that will recur in many different forms. One is democracy, the high-energy democracy, and the other is the democratized market economy, expressed or developed through the creation of a knowledge economy for the many. Now let me begin with democracy. And propose the following idea. All the democracies that exist in the world are flawed or relatively weak democracies. By what criterion? By the criterion that they impede, they inhibit structural change, the mastery of the structure, they make change depend on crisis in the double form of war or of ruin. And they therefore renew the power of the dead over the living. Now, what are the characteristics of a low-energy democracy? Let me exemplify them with respect to the American political arrangements, because they're the next topic in the course. These weak democracies, which are the only democracies that exist in the world, are in the first place low-energy democracies, meaning they are all democracies that are based on a low level of public engagement in political life. And the assumption of the theory of the low democracies the assumption that is common to conservative political science and conservative statecraft is that there's a pendular relation between political mobilization or political activity and political institutionalization, as the American political scientists said. A democracy must be either cold and institutional, or it must be hot and anti-institutional or extra-institutional. In other words, at the end of the day, you have to choose between Madison and Mussolini. A hot democracy is an anti or extra-institutional democracy. A cold democracy is a democracy of reason, of deliberation, and of the containment of popular passions. And of course, this opposition between hot and cold, between the participatory and the deliberative, is not an opposition that the leftists can or should accept. So what he must want is a democracy that is both hot and institutional. And he must insist that alternative political institutions may differ among themselves in the extent to which they require and promote public participation. Now, what does that depend on? It then devolves into a series of concrete initiatives, none of which all by itself can produce the outcome, the desired outcome of a democracy that is hot and institutional, but that in their combined and cumulative effect lead in that direction. So they may be arrangements about the relation of money to politics, public finance, a political activity, prohibition of use of private money, and so forth. Arrangements with respect to the access of the political parties and the social movements to the means of mass communication, like the television or social media. Electoral regimes. But with respect to electoral regimes, it seems that the causal implications of a political regime are very circumstantial. So, for example, in one society in which there's a rigidified party system, with many parties, majoritarian first past the post voting can have a progressive effect. And in another society in which there are few parties with rigid structures, it can be the opposite. Proportional representation is needed to shake them up. Or a rule of mandatory voting. Many countries in the world make the vote obligatory. Both rich countries and developing countries. And in no country that has adopted a rule of mandatory voting has that rule ever been revoked. So the consequence of the rule of mandatory voting is to produce a collective habit. Now understand what a rule of mandatory voting means. It doesn't mean that you have to be brought in chains to the voting booth to vote. It means that you pay a small fine if you don't vote. But under a rule of mandatory voting, abstention has a completely different significance from what it has in a system of optional voting. If in a rule of mandatory voting a major part of the electorate refuses to vote nevertheless, that's a denunciation of the electoral system. Under a rule of optional voting, abstention has an ambiguous meaning. So one set of constitutional innovations that would compose a high-energy democracy would be innovations that would elevate the temperature of politics. By the temperature of politics, I mean the level of organized, sustained political mobilization through this combination of initiatives and of context-dependent arrangements. And the premise is that a politics with a rich structural content is necessarily a hot politics, a politics of intense mass mobilization. There can't be a politics with rich structural content unless that politics requires and produces a high level of political engagement. The second set of innovations has to do with the tempo of politics. And let me illustrate the problem I have in mind by allusion to the American arrangements. So in the American constitutional system, there are two architectural principles. There is a principle of fragmentation of power. There are many different powers in the state. And there's a principle of slowing down of politics through the effect of Madison's scheme of checks and balances. And the Americans think that these two principles are indissolubly connected: the fragmentation of power and the slowing down of politics. But in fact, they're not necessarily connected. They're connected by design and by intention. And the intention was, in part, to inhibit the transformation of society by politics. Deliberately. So, to create an economic and social order that was, in a sense, a perpetual motion machine, and to protect it against the storms of politics. But you could have a constitutional design that reaffirmed the liberal principle of the fragmentation of power, but repudiated the conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. For example, under a presidential regime. You could say that whenever there's a stalemate between the executive and the legislative branch, either branch could unilaterally exercise the prerogative of dissolving the impasse between the two branches by calling early elections. But the exercise of the prerogative would always have to be bilateral for both branches, so that the branch that exercised the constitutional prerogative would have to pay the political price of running the electoral risk. And under that scheme, the presidential regime would be turned on its head and would become a device for the acceleration of politics, the acceleration of the tempo of politics. And this illustrates an important principle in institutional design, that very small institutional changes can have very large consequences. You see the scheme that I'm imagining? Do you understand it? It's a presidential regime in which, because it's a presidential regime, there's a direct route to the center of power. A president elected with a strong popular mandate reaches the center of power in one big step. But the problem with the presidential regime is it can be designed in such a way that once that president reaches the center of power, he finds his hands are tied. As Roosevelt did. Franklin Roosevelt had as his allies the greatest war in human history and the greatest economic collapse of the 20th century. And even then he had trouble because the constitutional system was designed to give him trouble. So now I'm taking this conception of a high-energy democracy and I'm trying to fill it up with institutional content. And the first measure then was to create the arrangements that would elevate the heat, the level of popular mobilization or participation. And the second set of initiatives are initiatives that were designed to increase the tempo. So now we have a democracy with greater heat and faster pace. Now let's take a third set of innovations. Innovations that in a federal system have to do with the capacity of the several parts of the country to initiate changes, so that changes don't have to be initiated just at the top or at the center. And we can imagine two different stages. One stage in which change is initiated collaboratively, by collaborative experimentation among groups of states, for example. Cooperation is the initial stage of experimentalism in a federal system. And then we can imagine further into the future a second stage in which a state, a part of the country, negotiates the right to secede from the general solutions and try out some alternative model, some counter model of the national future. So we think this way. A country goes down a certain road, but it hedges its bets and allows parts of itself to try out experimental alternatives to that road. Because after all, in political life, it's not the abstract doctrine that counts, it's the experience of actually doing it and trying it out. And of course, it could be such an ability to secede from the general solutions and do things differently can be abused. It can be an instrument of privilege or oppression, so it have to be vetted by both the legislative and the judicial authorities. Now, if you just take those three sets of innovations that I've described up to now, the heightening of the temperature, the hastening of the pace, and the deepening of experimental divergence within the system. The question is, where should you begin? Where does the progressive have the best chance of beginning? And the general judgment of the American progressives seems to be it's with respect to the arrangements that have to do with the temperature and specifically with the relation of money to political activity and to the campaigns. I have the impression that that's a mistake and that the best place to begin lies in the third area of the experimental divergence, because it is the one that arouses at the outset least opposition and has the greatest potential fecundity. So, for example, in the United States, almost all the Republican governors have experimental industrial policies. All of them want to have their own little Silicon Valley. It's absurd. And the vast majority of them are going to fail. But the fact that they are trying to do this, that they are trying to experiment with respect to the supply side and not the demand side of the economy, with respect to production and not with respect just to consumption, is immensely interesting and shows that there's more there than appears on the surface. The majority of their little Silicon Valleys are like Potemkin villages. They're not real. It's imagining that you have something that physically looks similar, that has the same idea, produce the same reality. Now, I could add to these three sets of innovations I've described, others. For example, innovations that have to do with confrontation with evils that consist in the inability of a disadvantaged or excluded group to escape by the forms of collective action that are available to it from some situation of entrenched disadvantage or exclusion. So there is not in the contemporary state a device for structural change that is localized that say it's a particular set of social practices or a particular kind of organization. And that has to be changed piecemeal. The contemporary democratic state has no device by which to engage in transformation that is structural but localized, because that seems to be illegitimate in this tripartite state. So what has happened, for example, in the United States is that during a certain historical period, the federal judges took it on, this task. And this was called the structural injunctions, or complex enforcement, by which they decided that a whole organization like a prison system or a school system or a set of mental asylums, mental hospitals, were in contradiction with ideals attributed to the law, and they set out to change them part by part, nominating managers for those organizations. And why did the judges do it? It wasn't a judicial attribution. They did it because they wanted to do it, and because no one else offered to do the job, until they ran out of power, because of course they wouldn't have been allowed to start redesigning the banks, for example. They could get away with relatively marginal social institutions. So in a society that is a class society, like all the contemporary societies, in which a class society coexists with a democracy, there are going to be forms of disadvantage which the people who suffer them cannot escape with the instruments available to them. And they need then some form of external assistance through this form of intervention that I'm calling both structural and localized. Now we could add one final set of institutional innovations, and these are the innovations that add to representative democracy some elements of direct or participatory democracy. It can be at the local level, through the participation of community groups and neighborhood associations in local self-government, or it can be at the national level through comprehensive programmatic plebiscites. Now imagine a system like that, composed of those elements that I just described. I would say that's an example of what I'm calling a high-energy democracy. A high-energy democracy is a democracy which facilitates structural reform, the mastery of social life, creates trouble for the class system, weakens the dependence of change on crisis. In other words, change becomes less dependent on crisis. It requires less crisis to produce change, and overthrows the rule of the living by the dead. Remember, in the American example, Thomas Jefferson, an early opponent of the cult of the Constitution, wanted the Constitution of the United States to be trashed every 2 generations on the argument that the dead should not be allowed to rule the living. And obviously his advice has not been followed. So in other words, the experimental character of democratic politics is not intrinsic, inherent. It depends on the institutional arrangements interacting with these ideological conceptions that I've been exploring. So there, I'm trying to evoke the conception of a high-energy democracy. And I'm saying all the democracies that exist in the world are flawed democracies by comparison to that standard. And what is the economic counterpart to a flawed democracy? To a high-energy democracy? The economic counterpart is the democratization of the market order. So the model of ideological conflict in the world in the recent historical period has been the state versus the market. More state, less market, more market, less state, or compromise between market and state. That's social democracy or social liberalism. And here we have another idea, that a new focus of ideological conflict is emerging in the world, which is the conflict among the alternative forms of political, economic, and social pluralism of a market economy, a democracy, or an independent civil society. And what makes politics serious then is its level of institutional ambition. Everything else are like the waves of the sea that come and go. What remains is the institutional legacy. Now, what do you think? Yes.
I know this isn't a class called Conservative Alternatives, but I wonder what your take is on the conservative movement in the US right now, because it seems like they're taking a lot of your ideas in terms of heating up democracy, hastening the pace at which things are changing, calling for institutional changes, and I wonder if it's not going to leave the left or the Democratic Party kind of holding the bag, being the institutionalists, being the status quo people, especially as the Democratic Party continues to elect people who talk about good billionaires and the like.
Well, you're asking a very complicated and very important question, right?
I'm sorry.
So in this historical period, energetic politics has come mainly from the right, and not just in the United States, in the whole world. And the left has been mainly consigned to this function of humanization. If you ask the leftists, the contemporary leftists, the majority of them, what is your program? The correct answer is, my program is the program of my conservative adversaries with a humanizing discount. I put a human face, a humane face on their project. So it's a debate in which the defeat is recorded right at the outset, because it's the other party that controls the agenda. So I think the answer, if the answer is not less politics, the answer has to be more politics. But there are no guarantees, right? So it could go off the rails. It could be a disaster. It's crucial that we look to the institutional content. So for the most part, the right has not really developed what I call a high-energy democracy. It simply strengthened executive authority. The outcome has been Caesarism, not high-energy democracy. So crucial to high-energy democracy is that an increase in the heat combined with a transformation of the structures. If we just have the heat without a change in the structure, we get Bonapartism. And that's the form that's taken. And it's and the agenda and the political agenda is also impoverished, right? The economic agenda, the agenda in political economy. Because what's the economic project? Conventional industry has declined in the whole world. And the main attitude of the right has been to buy it a few more years through subsidies and through protectionism. Not to promote this project that I alluded to, replacing the knowledge economy for a few by a knowledge economy for the many. But in the meantime, the problem is the one that you describe. So let me just say a few words about the economic side of this. In every historical period, there is a most advanced practice of production. Adam Smith and Karl Marx, the two greatest economic thinkers in the history of economics, both believed that the best way to understand the economy and its potential was to study the most advanced practice of production. For Smith, it was commercial society. For Marx, it was what he called capitalism. Because they thought the most advanced practice of production is the one that most deeply reveals our human potential. In the 20th century, the most advanced practice of production was conventional industry, now sometimes called Fordist mass production. The production of standardized goods and services on the basis of rigid machines and production processes and semi-skilled labor. And the prescription of development economics throughout the world, the basic teaching of development economics until the end of the 20th century was there's a shortcut to economic growth. The shortcut is to take workers and resources from the less productive sectors and put them in the most productive sectors. Meaning, in practice, take them from agriculture and put them in industry. And it was generally acknowledged that travel on this shortcut to economic growth was ultimately limited by what they call the fundamentals, education and institutions. But the truth is that with respect to these fundamentals, there was very little constraint. For example, a great deal of lip service was paid to education. But in a Fordist mass production factory, the worker didn't need much education. What did he need? He needed a disposition to obey, manual dexterity, especially in the form of hand-eye coordination, and elementary literacy and numeracy, to be able to understand commands handed from on top and imposed on him. That's all he needed. And the institutional requirements came down to having a regulated market economy that had a place for a planning technocracy, who were the people who staged these development projects. The knowledge economy is not like that, because the knowledge economy has maximalist requirements, not minimalist requirements. It's not like a kit of stereotype machines and industrial practices that you can put on an airplane and take from one place to another. It's a whole complicated set of non-stereotyped arrangements. So the knowledge economy, the new vanguard that replaces that old vanguard, the new vanguard, unlike the old vanguard, is multi-sectoral. It's present in every sector of production. In intellectually dense services, and even precision or scientific agriculture. But in each sector, it appears as a fringe, as a socially exclusive fringe. Excluding the vast majority of firms and of workers. This insular character of the new vanguard has momentous consequences for the future of society. First of all, it leads to a slowdown of growth, a period of innovation, of economic and technological innovation, which paradoxically coincides with slowdown. But how could there not be slowdown if we're denying to the vast majority of workers and firms access to the most advanced practice of production? On the other hand, the aggravation of economic inequality. The economic inequality is anchored in the hierarchical segmentation of parts of production, in the abyss that becomes deeper and deeper between the vanguard and the rear guard. And paradoxically, the new vanguard, rather than spreading to other parts of the economy, recedes further and further into its island. So the masters of this new vanguard discover a way to bifurcate the process of production. The routinized or commoditized part they keep for themselves. No, the routinized or commoditized part they subcontract to firms and workers in remote parts of the world with lower tax take and lower regulatory burden and lower wages. And the creative and lucrative part they keep for themselves. So through this bifurcation that I'm describing, instead of the vanguard spreading until it encompasses the whole economy, it falls back into itself. So what then is the fundamental productivist project in this situation? It's the creation of a knowledge economy for the many. And the political instrument for the creation, for that project, is what I called in the previous part of the argument, the high energy democracy. Not guaranteeing that that will be the result, but making it possible. And that is one way of defining early on the main focal point of the ideological struggle today. It has a particular institutional content. It's about this economic project, to which I just alluded, in this political context of the high energy democracy. Now, of course, many people in the world would say that these events are in the grip of impersonal technological forces that we can't control. But the same debate, or an equivalent to this, the same debate, happens in every area. So take technology. Is there an intrinsic logic of technological evolution that just carries us along? No. Technology has no intrinsic evolutionary logic. It has the logic that we impart to it. How should we think about technology? Here are two ways to think about technology. In one way, technology is the materialization of the channel between our experiments in the mobilization of natural forces in our favor, the magnetic force, the electrical force, the nuclear force, and our experiments in cooperating with one another in work, the technical division of labor. That's one way of thinking about technology. And in that way of thinking it, everything depends not just on the advance of science and its use to us in manipulating knowledge, but in our experiments with how we work together with respect to those experiments. And now here's a second way of thinking about technology. Technology has to do with our experiments in relating the practices that we have already learned how to repeat to the practices that we have not yet learned how to repeat. So, what is a machine? Everything that we can learn how to repeat, we are able to express in a formula or an algorithm. And everything that we have expressed formulaically or algorithmically, we can then embody in a mechanical device. The mechanical device does for us what we have already learned how to repeat, so that we can preserve our supreme and in a sense, our only resource, our time for the not yet repeatable. So the point of a machine is not to imitate us, but to complement us or equip us. No, for example, we shouldn't think of artificial intelligence as if its objective were to mimic the mind, to be a proxy for the human mind. And in fact, almost all the discussion of artificial intelligence proceeds on that, exactly on that assumption, that its supreme achievement would be to produce a proxy for the mind. We should think of it as the opposite. The point is not that it should become like the mind. The point is that it should excel at the things that a non-mind can excel at, so that we can use it as an instrument, we who have imagination. And what is imagination? Imagination has two stages, two steps. Has the step of distancing from the phenomenon. An image, after all, is the memory of a perception. To imagine it, we have to be distant from it. And then it has the second and crucial step, which is the subsumption of the phenomenon under a range of variation. What the phenomenon can become, can next become, in the domain of the adjacent possible. And now that I'm saying this, I want to make one other observation. The two large institutional projects which I described in this class, the project of a high-energy democracy and the project of a knowledge economy for the many, are both collective and institutional instruments of the imagination. Their common purpose is to enhance and accelerate our power to create novelty, precisely by the way in which the imagination perpetually creates the new, through this subsumption of the existent under a penumbra of variation. That's how we understand anything in the world. We understand any phenomenon by imagining it transform. If we can't imagine it transform, we can't understand it at all. We just stare at it. And then insight degenerates into retrospective rationalization. So those two institutional projects of high-energy democracy and of a knowledge economy for the many are among the principal institutional instruments of our ability to create the new. And in the exercise of that power to create the new, we affirm our freedom, our greatness, our agency. That's freedom. That's how I'm beginning then, through this argument, to describe this activity of liberation. This is liberation. And technology, rather than being an impersonal force that runs on its own motion, is an invitation to these sets of experiments that I just described. It has no intrinsic logic. It has the logic we give it. And our interest, for example, with respect to these recent technologies, like artificial intelligence, is to make it not the proxy for us, but the complement to us. After all, the knowledge economy brings closer together the activity of discovery and the activity of production. Even in its elementary technologies like additive manufacturing, 3D printing, allows us to go quickly back and forth between conception and materialization. The deity that presides over this set of arrangements that I'm beginning to explore is the imagination. And the whole process of construction of these alternatives is the process of the empowerment of the imagination. And the question that especially interests the progressives is who will be admitted to this feast, whether it's all of humanity or some tiny elite of the enlightened and the privileged. Now, I think I've spoken to quite a lot of issues in this argument so far. And what about you? What do you think? Yes.
I want to return to your sort of political prescriptions or propositions. I'm wondering, I guess, what you think about the possibility for like an experimentalist, much more federalized process of like allowing states to go their own way versus the federal government to be a regressive force as opposed to a progressive force.
Of course. So first of all, let me say with respect to the third set of institutional innovations, remember, are those that have to do with cooperation and experimentation, especially within the Federation, though I think it also applies in unitary states. It's not limited to federations. So we know famously from American history that the experimental diversification of parts of a federal system can be a device of persecution, abuse, discrimination, of course. And that's why I said that we have to be vetted. But the basic idea is the idea that as a society goes down a certain path, it hedges its bets and allows parts of itself to generate a counter model of the national future. That's the idea. Obviously, for that idea not to become the instrument of discrimination, of prejudice, of exclusion, it has to be controlled and vetted in all sorts of ways. But the idea is that we don't want just to commit ourselves to one path and to give it all hostages. We want to preserve our ability to examine it, having in mind other alternatives, other models. That's the basic idea. And of course the idea can be subject to counter models, and the same kind of argument that your colleague mentioned there would apply. So classical liberal thought is an insurance policy, right? It says, you're asking us to get on the roller coaster, but the roller coaster can be calamitous. So we want to go on the roller coaster. We want to have this experiment, but the experiment has to be subject to the possibility of continuing it. The roller coaster can end in the coup, right? But the fundamental instinct of the Democrat is the more experimentation, the better, in principle, subject to these limitations. The defect of politics you'll cure with more politics. The dangers of a vision are cured by having more visionary contests. More, not less. But what you can't accept is this idea that therefore you can't get on the roller coaster to start with. Because then the narrow form will end up being the prison. Yes.
If I'm jumping the gun here, please stop me. But the thing coming to mind right now is like sort of in the United States, the cultural and religious stronghold, I think, of the right and even, like everyday people who might not identify one way or the other in the system are sympathetic to this kind of culture of tradition and honoring forefathers and so forth. I'm curious, especially in contrast to a Democratic Party that does not at all illuminate an imaginative view of a possible future, how, in this context in the United States, you foresee a project like this or an attempt like this would be received? Is that something that's, start getting ground up and then cross that bridge when you get there? Or my mind is just telling me that the American people, by and large, would not advocate for something new, experiment on principle, right? So I'm curious where you see that sort of cultural standoff in here.
Well, I think that there are several things I want to say in response. So the first is something that unites the United States to the situation of the world as a whole, but also something that is distinctive to the United States. So here's the point about the world as a whole first. Let me say that first, and then I'll say the point about the United States. So going back to a claim I made in the first class. In the world, the vast majority of people are poor and disorganized. And their horizon of aspiration is petty bourgeois, small business class, and its equivalents. That's what I would call the subjective petty bourgeoisie. Subjective petty bourgeoisie because objectively they're not part of a small business class. But subjectively, that's their aspiration. They want to have a little farm, a store, to ply a trade. And the problem is that this is an archaic, relatively unproductive form. It can be made more productive through subsidiary technologies, but it doesn't have the scale and the complexity necessary to ascend the heights. So this problem takes different forms in India than it takes in the United States. But the problem is fundamentally the same. And the problem can only be solved because these are class societies. If there is a division within the elite, within the asset holding class, and if a part of the asset holding class rebels and seeks power for a productivist project of an inclusive productivism, which is another name for what I'm calling a knowledge economy for the many. And reaching power, it then offers that majority of the petty bourgeoisie or the subjective petty bourgeoisie alternatives. And the alternatives can begin quite modestly, just in finding the technologies and the practices they could make those archaic, isolated family businesses more productive. That's the point at which the American situation joins the predicament of humanity. That in the whole world, we're in a period in which the place of major organizations like unions, collective organizations, is diminishing, and the agency, the momentum, the preponderance is with this fragmented mass of poor people. And there has to be this productivist project that offers them a way up or a way out. Now, the specifically American form of this problem is the following. In the period before the Civil War, between independence and the Civil War, there were two different regimes in the United States. There was a slave regime in the South, a feudal slave society, and in the North, there was an economy of small-scale proprietors, artisans, tradespeople. I think I mentioned in the first class. In the 1830s, when Tocqueville visited the United States, only one white man in 5 worked for another white man. So this idea of agency, of the individual before God, the individual who is God, the American religion, in his own little world, cooperating, associating with his fellows, with the other farmers, with the other tradespeople. This is very profound in the United States. This was there at the beginning. And this economy in the North was destroyed at the same time that the economy of the South was destroyed. The Southern economy was washed away by the Civil War. So was the economy of the North. And there's a particular problem which explains the failure of this petty bourgeois ideal in the early 19th century. That problem was the property regime. That private property seemed to be indissolubly connected to small scale. The world of property-owning democracy, of the small proprietor, of the tradesman, of the farmer, was that world. And it was unable to invent the devices that would have allowed the small to gain the advantages of scale and aggregate resources. That's the technical problem that was not solved in the 19th century. And those were the people whom Karl Marx ridiculed as utopian socialists. They were the advocates of cooperation, of solidarity. So that's a technical, legal, institutional. So one of the ways in which there would be a productivist project would be to deal with that problem. Because now if there's going to be a knowledge economy for the many, it can't just be the platform oligopolies of Silicon Valley. There have to be a set of ways in which the majority of the people, through their existing businesses, which begin as isolated, archaic family businesses based on self-exploitation and family saving, can be introduced to this larger world and can gain the keys to higher productivity. And that would be one of the topics on the agenda of the high-energy democracy. So not thinking that, so it's not the idea that we're going to multiply Silicon Valleys and they're going to be all over the country. It's the idea that the existing productive apparatus of the country, which is for the most part very small scale and very old-fashioned, archaic, and unproductive, will begin to be raised up step by step and little by little through an economic policy which will be combined with this legal and institutional invention. That would be the subject of the productivists. So the progressives would no longer be focused just on the consumption side of the economy. They would be focused on the supply side, not just on the demand side. And they would have a project for the democratization of production and not simply for the democratization of consumption. That would be a fundamental change, because that then would create a situation in which the petty bourgeois majority of the country would have a productivist alternative before it, and there could then be a debate. Not just a debate in which on one side there are small-scale producers, and on the other side there are food stamps and taxes and entitlements, which is what exists. So I think that's the general direction into which this discussion is heading. Yes.
I think I find it kind of hard to let go of the idea of, like, the ideal at least of like collective union action.
Could you speak out louder, please? Or I'm
Sorry.
having trouble with your microphone.
I think I find it hard to let go of the like ideal of collective union action or collective worker action. I think partly because like so many people in the United States economy and globally are workers who are not part of the petty bourgeois.
But let me give you some bad news. There are no unions in the United States practically now. Unions now survive